What do angels and asps, adventures of the outhouse, a turkey, a coyote, and an upset wife have to do with each other? This is not a setup for a joke. Stay tuned. Welcome to Books on Air. We will answer that question. This is the podcast that you don't want to miss. You're about to get a sneak peek at what goes on behind the scenes with authors. We'll find out their secret recipe for creating a book. We'll tell you where they get their ideas, and you'll get the inside scoop on their next project. Want to know more? Okay, we'll tell you where to find them on social media. Let's meet today's author. I have to say that our guest today is a really funny and interesting guy. His name is Lucius McCray, and he's joining me to talk about his book, Humor Through the Ages. Lucius, welcome.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here.
You know, your book is a collection of your words, mostly true stories about your friends and your relatives that start back in the 1890s. And this kind of story was actually sort of a family tradition. And we had it too. People used to talk to each other. I remember my grandparents, when we would go visit them, they had a circle of lawn chairs in the backyard, and neighbors would come over, and there'd be family members, and people would sit in the dark, no lights, just sit in the dark, and you'd hear these disembodied voices talking, laughing, telling stories. There were lightning bugs in the air. I mean, it almost had a magical quality about it because it was this kind of oral history sharing. Tell me about your experience with this kind of oral family history and how it influenced you, because I know it did.
Oh, yes, definitely. I was about to say, it's funny. You more or less described my summers growing up, and they were a little bit different because we were up in Virginia. A lot of times the same thing would go on during the day, during what I would call, I guess, it wasn't harvest because it wasn't the fall, it was summer, but stringing green beans and that sort of thing, mm-hmm. and shelling beans. They would sit under a big oak tree in the shade, and everybody was involved, including us kids. And yeah, we would sit there and listen to them tell stories. And I grew up in Southern California, and the reason all this hit me growing when we visit our relatives is Southern California back in the 70s, without cable, we had probably 20, 23 channels because Orange County is, it's a suburb of L.A., and back then everything was TV was coming out of there. And we would go to Blacksburg, Virginia, between these mountains, and maybe they got 1.5 television channels, and I think maybe 2 or 3 radio channels. And so all we had was each other, and as you're talking about, to tell stories and talk with each other and whatnot. And so really I hate to say it was thrust on me as a child because it was more enjoyable than that, right? It was just so much fun. And when I started writing, Lucius and his stories just sort of blossomed because this is funny. The way they became a reality. Do you remember the solar eclipse a few years ago?
Sure.
Okay. So back then, there's a place called Orangeburg, South Carolina. It's a town between here and the beach, between where I live in Charlotte and the beach. And they came out with this big ad campaign, and they said they were the center of the lunar eclipse. Now, my father was a rocket engineer. He grew up in Southwest Virginia, but he was a rocket engineer. He's one of the men that helped get us on the moon and in space and everything. So I grew up around aerospace, and I'm like, that's not how a solar eclipse works. But I thought it was so funny. I was like, this is such great PR. And sure enough, it worked. They had the place, my understanding was on the news, they had like packed out the hotels. Literally the whole town was full of people. I mean, everybody figured this was the place to go. And I had just started writing. I'd been writing for about 6 months or so. And it dawned on me, I said, wouldn't it be hilarious if there was this guy, Lucius, and he was selling lemonade, but he was also selling moonshine to all the tourists.
I love it. I love it.
And Lucius was born, and from there, that's why I say they're mostly true. From that story, I started tapping into my memory of some actual things I had heard growing up, and these were on the internet originally. I was trying to remember. I think they're not up there right now. I actually had to pull. I had so many stories on my website because that's sort of my creativity outlet between books. And I had so many at one point, I actually had to take them down to start over because it was slowing the website down. So it may not be up there now. But anyway, so Lucius, he was like a weekly event, and he would come up with different stories. And then I decided at some point in time, after I did that, to start these books. And, I love the idea of telling these sorts of stories because it is what we grew up with. And I think, we need, of all the times, we need that now. I feel like we do. We need some happiness. We need some joy. We need to remember what it's like, to be family and friends and to laugh.
Now, you've piqued our listeners' interest. You realize you're talking about Lucius in the third person, and they're going, wait a minute, I thought this guy was Lucius. Well, you are Lucius, but that's really a pen name for Gary McPherson. I love it. We need to tell them that so that they're going, wait a minute, what's this guy talking about? And I could not agree with you more. I think Humor Through the Ages is an absolutely perfect book right now. And one of the things that occurred to me is that in all of the hustle and bustle and all of the electronic gadgets that we have and people, you see people in restaurants, they don't even talk to each other. They're all looking at a tablet or they're looking at a cell phone. One of the things that I hope your book does, Lucius/Gary, is to get people to actually talk to each other. Families right now are in such close proximity. They're cheek to jowl like they've never been before in the modern age. Maybe they should think about the stories that you tell in your book, because this is part of, air quotes, growing up. They should tell these kinds of stories that everybody has with their children and share that oral history, because oral histories have been coming down since, I guess, the cavemen. I mean, who knows? But this is one of the ways that we share things. And I love the idea of what you're doing with this. I just think it's great. Let's give the author, the listeners, a little bit of an overview of the book. And the teaser that I did at the beginning about angels and asps, adventures of the outhouse, a turkey, a coyote, and an upset wife, those are all titles of chapters from the books. I just couldn't resist using it. So tell me a little bit about the book itself.
Okay, yeah. So the book was an interesting one to write because I wanted to go back as far as I could validate. And some of these stories actually come from my mother. She's in her late 80s. And they come from my mother and from some cousins and whatnot. And they go all the way back to, I believe, my great-grandmother back in the late 1890s. And so Angels and Asps, one of my favorite stories, and everyone, my beta readers that worked with me when I was writing the book, everyone said the first story was their favorite because my aunt, my great-aunt, I said, yeah, great-aunt. I was trying to remember if she's my great or my great-great. I believe great. Anyway, she was always known as this real pious woman. And everyone, for as long as I can remember, they've always told the story again and again about the fact that she was terrified of snakes. And she would never say an unkind word. She would never cuss. She would never do anything like that. And so, but when she would come across snakes, she would cuss like a sailor.
Wow.
It was just like that was her trigger. That was just her one thing that just, that was it. She just like let loose. And so the story I tell under Angels and Ants, I start from the beginning. And one of the things I try to do in each story, and I set the tone in the first story, is to take the reader from today and sort of go back in time. So like I start beginning, I start talking about basically things that I don't like, which particularly are bugs, hate bugs. And then I backtrack for the first couple of paragraphs, what my likes and dislikes are, what life is like in the country today. And then, bring the reader back into time to when my great aunt lived, just to give a comparison for the reader. And then I tell this story about my great aunt, because it is so funny. I mean, she was this woman that everyone thought was, when she was, I mean, I'm not saying thought as if she wasn't, but, her reputation was she was this real godly, proper woman. But if she got near a snake, as the saying goes, she cussed a blue streak.
It all went away.
Yeah. It was like, even my mom was like, I think she saved up.
I love it.
And she dipped snuff. That was the other thing she was known for, and that's actually in the story as well, about her dipping snuff. So it was just because back in those days in the mountains, that was the thing folks did. Even women, dip snuff. And so the stories, the rest of the book are set in the same way, where they sort of jump through time, not in a way that's chaotic by any means, but in a way so that you can see how things have changed or remain the same over the years. And then the last two stories in the book, like I say, it's mostly true. So the middle of the book is fairly true stories about my dad, and then my best friend who I lost when we were 18, and some of the pranks I pulled on him, because our family growing up, they've always been pranksters, always.
Oh,
I grew up with it with my dad, and even to this day, I mean, if I go up to Virginia and visit relatives, although they're older than I am now, so they don't have the energy, but if they could, they would do it. I mean, we laugh about some of the stuff when we were younger. And then, but the last couple chapters in the book are pure Lucius, and like you said, it's my pen name, but it's not just my pen name. It is a person that I had created. So his stories, such as in humor through the ages, they're always told first person, just like we were saying, just like you're sitting around with your family and telling the story. And so those last couple stories are mostly not true, mostly fiction, but they are based on all this history, so that the reader can see basically how Lucius, who he is, right? Who he is in my mind, in a matter of speaking.
I think your language,
who this person is.
I think the way you have Lucius speak, his voice would let us know that he's not you. He's you, but he's not you. He's relaying your memories and your thoughts. And it struck me that those pranks you were talking about would also contribute to that oral history in those stories, because those are stories about that incident that are the kinds of things that live after the person, like the great aunt you were talking about. Her idiosyncrasies have lived after her, and now she's immortalized, as it were, in a story. I think this is just such a great idea, Gary.
Well, thank you. Well, and it's funny you mentioned about it, the way I write's different. It is different. It's actually very hard to do. I tell people all the time, I said, if something looks easy, it normally means to do that easy thing was a very hard task. And I'm like, to write in Lucius's voice is a hard thing, because I could really get into some dialect, but it would be hard to read. You got to get that balance. But at the same time, what's funny is when I'm writing Lucius, when I'm writing one of his books, it drives my wife crazy, because I will start talking like him, like when I'm around the house.
Oh, how funny. I love it. You really get into the character.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. My wife says that those books are really the truest part of me. She thinks that that's really, and it may be true. And considering that when I write as Lucius, I do tend to pick up some of his habits in real life, whereas if I write other things, that doesn't really happen. But for Lucius, I actually do. It's a lot of fun, and it is, like you said, it is, especially this book. This book was super special. I mean, I've written Country Boy and Humor Deeper Than a Holler, and those were similar ideas, similar, mostly true stories, but this one was special because these were stories that it started out with family bringing me stories, because after the first 2 books, they had read those, and they're like, oh, I got to tell you about this real thing that happened. And then I started gathering stories from the family because I was like, I really want to put this out there. And like you said, the hope is, I have this in the preface, my hope is that it will, help people sort of reminisce about where they grew up, where they came from. Because like I say in the book, I'm like, you don't have to be from the country to enjoy this sort of storytelling or to even enjoy the memories of your childhood. I've got a neighbor next door that grew up in New Jersey, and he is your stereotypical New Jersey Italian man. And he grew up in the city, and he tells me stories about being, in these buildings that are, like 15 stories tall, and how everyone knew everyone, and like half the building was he was related to. And it's basically the same sort of thing. It's just a different setting as far as where he grew up. And the dialect.
And the dialect, yes. That New Jersey dialect is very different. I agree. I just think this is such a great idea because the things that you are saying, I hope, will encourage the people who read the book and who are hearing what you and I have to say. Now, you're all over the place. You have done so many things. This is obviously not your first book. You have another series that you call the Berserker series that I think it's murder and mayhem. It's a totally different kind of genre. You're also all over the internet. You are doing so many things. Let me start out with where people could find your books. Now, I know that Humor Through the Ages is on Amazon. And let me just give the title of the book and let me spell the name so that they know what to look for if they're interested in the book. If they go to Amazon, there's that big search feature at the top. And you can just put in Humor Through the Ages. And the author, because this is Gary's pen name, is Lucius, Lucius McCray, McCray. Click on that, and it will take you right to the book. And you'll see the cover of the book, and up in the upper right-hand corner, it says, click here to open. There's a wonderful excerpt of the first story that you were just talking about, and also about the preface that you talked about as well. I think people would read that sample and right away want to buy the book, and they can do it right there on Amazon. Your work is available all kinds of places. Where else could they find your books, Gary? Okay,
so Humor Through the Ages is primarily Amazon. My other books, including Country Boy and Humor Deeper Than a Holler, which were both by Lucius, are on Amazon, but they're also on I was trying to Google. I was trying to remember the Google ebooks, Apple, and many others. And the best way to find, if people want physical books, because that's actually one of the easiest ways to find the books, there's a site called IndieBound. And if you go to IndieBound and put in Lucius McCray, you can find all the books and the different locations that they're available. That's really the easiest way to do it.
Now, you've also got... Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, you also have audiobooks. I think this would be a fabulous way to hear these stories. Did you read these, or is there a particular organization that put these together for you?
Oh, this is my favorite, especially with Humor Through the Ages. So I use a company called Findaway Voices. They are fairly new. They were not even around when I did my first novel, Joshua in the Shadow of Death. Back then it was just Audible, really. But Findaway Voices, similar to IndieBound, is multi-platform. So there are 43 platforms that they put the audiobooks on, including Audible, but also like Audiobook, Libro FM, Apple again, Google, etc. And for Humor Through the Ages, I'll tell you right now, and this is, I know I'm the author, so it sounds like I'm kind of tooting my own horn, but actually I'm going to toot the horn of my narrator. I really got fortunate. The man's name is Jay Arkin. He's actually a voice actor, as well as an author, producer, and a litany. I mean, yes, I do a lot of things. This guy has done a ton of different things. He's traveled. He's done stage. He's just amazing. And we just released the book on audiobook, I think it was last week. So it's not on Audible yet. Audible takes about a month. Once Find a Way sends their file, they kind of sit on it and I guess do their QA to make sure everything's okay. So it takes about a month for it to show up on Audible. But Jay Arkin, as I tell people, he doesn't so much narrated as he acts through the book. So, and I've told people, if you want to know what Lucius McCray, what he sounds like in my head, Jay Arkin nailed it. If you hear him reading, I'm like, that is Lucius McCray. 100%. He is Lucius McCray as far as how he read the book.
I love it.
It's incredible. It is incredible. It really is. Now, the other books were actually narrated by a friend of mine who he moved out of the state and he's gone on to other things. But all the other books, including the other two Lucius books, were narrated by a gentleman named Chad Bauer. He was a news announcer here in Charlotte. And we're friends, and so he offered to do the books, and so he did those books. And he did a great job. He really did. But Humor Through the Ages, Jay Arkin, he doesn't just read the book. I mean, it really does come alive.
You've got that list of where they can find the audiobooks on your Facebook page. Let's give the listeners your Facebook page address.
Yes. So my Facebook page address is GMcWriter. It's GMACWRITER.
Now you got a fabulous website. I went to the website. You're a podcaster. You do Lunch with Lucius and Lucas. That's on there. You're also a blogger. You're on Twitter. You're doing Tumblr. Is there anything you're not doing, Gary?
I don't do Instagram.
You're everywhere. If they just put
it keeps me busy.
If they put you in Google, 1,000 sites are going to come up because you really are all over the place. Tell me a little bit about the podcast. Now, if they go to the website, let's give them the website address.
Okay, yeah, the website address, fortunately, is very similar to the Facebook account.
Very cool.
It's GMcWriter. Yeah, it's GMcWriter.com, so GMACWRITER.com. And that name came from one of my sons. He's a gamer, and he always went by C-Mac. And when I was trying to come up with a memorable name that no one had used, that's how GMcWriter came about. So anyway, so yeah, GMcWriter.com. And that's honestly, if your folks want to search, either Lucius or GMcWriter are the best ways, because believe it or not, there's probably a half a dozen or more Gary McPhersons that have written books.
Oh, wow.
And you go out there and you put in my name, you'll find me, but you'll also find, thankfully, they're all nonfiction. But there, if you put in Gary McPherson, there's a ton. I told somebody the other day, if I had to do it again, I probably would have used my initials for those first books, for the GW instead of Gary. But in any case, so Lucius or GMcWriter is the easiest way to find my material if you want to search for it. And they're on the website. It's a menu-driven system, and there's actually a link there that says, or a menu that says podcast. And you click on podcast, and it'll pop up.
And there's also stories you can find. I mean, there's just all kinds of stuff on the website. So if people really want a sample of who you are, and if they really want to know about you, there's lots and lots and lots of information on the website. I loved it. I thought it was terrific. I listened to some of the podcasts, and you're really funny. I mean, the Lunchtime with Lucius and Lucas is really funny and interesting. You and I could keep talking and talking and talking, but our time is really up, Gary. Mm-hmm. What do you really want to leave the listener/reader with? If someone gets the book, whether they do it electronically or physically, when they close that last page metaphorically and are finished, do you just want them to feel entertained? Is there something you want them to take away? What do you want them to leave with?
I definitely want them to be entertained. I also would like them, hopefully, to feel a little bit of nostalgia. And, just it's meant to be a happy book to make people feel good. The other two books by Lucius McCray are a similar vein. And the other thing I used to joke about with the earlier books, because the chapters were a little bit shorter, is I said it was a good book to put in your bathroom. I wouldn't want to do a short read because all the stories are, they're independent, but they do link. As I tell people, I said, you don't have to read Country Boy to read Humor Through the Ages, but some of the characters in Humor Through the Ages are introduced in the other two books. So, but yeah, it's just more about, it's to be entertained, but it's also just to, feel good and hopefully, bring back some good memories. Because that's the whole point of why I wrote Lucius. The Berserker series that you'd mentioned, those are much darker. I mean, as I tell people, the first book that I wrote there, The Shadow of Death, starts out with a suicide. And my personality, while I actually enjoy writing and reading thrillers, my personality, I tend to joke around all the time, as you know. And so these were my outlet, and again, they've just sort of grown organically into something much bigger. And I really, to me, with life and everything else, even if we weren't going through what everyone's going through right now, you need to take time out to just sort of smile and laugh and kind of find the funny and the good in everything that's going on around you. And that's what I want people to walk away with, is, maybe hopefully change their perspective a little bit on what's going on in their life.
You have just been delightful. I feel like you and I have known each other for years. It's just been such a treat to talk to you today, and I could not agree with you more about a need right now for something that's funny. But the other thing that I really like about your work is that hopefully you're encouraging our modern day people to sit down and just talk and tell those stories about what they remember about their childhood, or the incident that's come down through the family about what Grandpa did, or Grandma at Christmas did XYZ. I think those things need to come down to these children who are so involved with their phones and their games and their tablets and TikTok and all of those kinds of things, that they're losing so much of the connection with their families and their heritage. So thank you for writing these books, and thank you for being our guest today. It's just been delightful. Gary/Lucius.
Well, thank you for having me on. This has been a lot of fun.
Remember, you can find Humor Through the Ages by Lucius McCray on Amazon. You've been listening to the Books on Air podcast, brought to you on webtalkradio.net. You can also hear this podcast on iTunes and iHeartRadio. I'm Suzanne Harris, and I hope that you'll join our next Books on Air podcast. Remember, it's the place to be, and thanks so much for listening.